In today's world, everyone tells you to fight louder, prove harder, and never back down. But what if the strongest move isn't fighting back but walking away in silence? We live in a society obsessed with noise, likes, comments, claps, comebacks. But the truth is, silence can break someone's ego far deeper than any argument ever could. They say closure comes from confrontation. But what if the real closure, the one they'll never admit, comes from you evolving so far beyond them, they can't even reach the new version of you? Welcome to Stoic Craft, the channel where we turn ancient Stoic wisdom into modern strategies for strength, peace, and resilience. If you've ever been betrayed, doubted, or underestimated, this is where you'll learn to rise without noise, to heal without apology, and to master the storm instead of being consumed by it. They didn't just cross a line, they crossed the one soul who could have helped them escape the prison of their own flaws. And now their downfall has begun. They believed they were clever, that they had slipped away unnoticed. They mistook your patience for weakness, your silence for surrender. But what they never realized is that silence is not the absence of pain. It's the seed of power, quietly growing in the shadows until the day it stands taller than their illusions. When you finally walk away from someone who tried to break you, it's not simply a retreat. It's a declaration. You're not just removing yourself from their chaos, you're dismantling their manipulation, exposing the lies they depended on, and forcing them to face the one opponent they've been running from their entire lives, themselves. This isn't about revenge, and it's not about wishing them harm. It's about justice, not the kind written in laws or delivered by courts, but a deeper psychological justice, the kind that doesn't arrive with noise and spectacle, but seeps in silently, whispering louder than any scream when the room goes quiet. You've seen it in real life. A woman finally walks away from a man who gaslit her for years, and suddenly it's not her unraveling, it's him. He thought he held control, but without her belief in him, he collapses under the weight of his own emptiness. Or consider the loyal friend who gave everything, only to be betrayed once. Now the betrayer scrolls through life, surrounded by shallow acquaintances, yet haunted by the absence of the one person who truly cared. This is not their story of victory. It's your story of elevation. You rise not loudly, not with public displays of defiance, but steadily, quietly, relentlessly. And in that silence there is a clarity they will never touch again. Because here is the truth. When someone crosses, a grounded soul, a person rooted in emotional intelligence and spiritual discipline, they don't just lose a companion. They lose access to peace, and that loss is permanent. Peace is the one currency they cannot replace, and once it slips through their fingers, it leaves a void that no distraction can fill. And here's the irony. They never planned to lose you. In fact, it never even crossed their mind that you were capable of walking away. In their shallow understanding, kindness meant compliance, patience meant passivity, forgiveness meant a free pass to keep breaking boundaries. You never gave them permission to cross. That was their fatal miscalculation. What they mistook for naive softness was, in fact, the highest form of strength discipline. You weren't silent because you had no defense. You were silent because you were calculating, observing, choosing your moment. There comes a time when grace transforms into a sword, and they pushed you to that edge. This is where manipulators always get it wrong. They read empathy as permission. Narcissists, manipulators, and emotionally stunted people cannot comprehend boundaries the way grounded, high-functioning souls do. They test slowly, almost innocently, at first a sarcastic remark disguised as humor, a lie covered by a charming smile, a selfish choice hidden under "I thought you wouldn't mind." And you, because you value peace more than petty confrontation, let the small things slide. Not because you were blind, but because you chose harmony over conflict. That is who you are. But to a person ruled by ego and insecurity, your grace doesn't read as wisdom. It reads as weakness. Your empathy becomes their excuse to push further. And that is how so many good, strong people fall into emotional traps. They think they are preserving peace, when in reality, they are feeding the ego of someone who mistakes patience for surrender. They believed you were too weak to stand up for yourself. It's not that they were unaware of the boundaries they were crossing. Oh, they knew. But they assumed you would never enforce them. They counted on your silence, your empathy, your willingness to let it go. What they didn't expect was that your patience had a limit, and once it ran out, there would be no going back. Second, the Stoic calm they couldn't read. You weren't silent because you were powerless. You were silent because you've done the inner work. You've endured storms that would have broken most people, and from that pain, you learned that raising your voice rarely fixes anything. You've studied yourself, studied others, and you've learned to observe before you react. So when things started to feel wrong, you didn't explode. You didn't give them the drama they craved. You reflected that calm unsettled them. Most people live on chaos. They need arguments, attention, or validation to feel alive. When someone like you remains grounded, calm, silent, unshaken, it terrifies them. Because your silence wasn't fear. It wasn't indifference. It was strategy. It was self-respect wrapped in stillness. Third, the moment they went too far. There's always a final straw. A moment so sharp, so disrespectful, that even your deep well of patience and grace runs dry. And when that moment arrived, you didn't collapse. You didn't beg for clarity or fight for their attention. You didn't play their game. You withdrew not in anger, but in clarity, not to punish them, but to protect yourself. And that was the turning point. They thought you'd cry. They thought you'd chase. They thought you'd fold back into the role they scripted for you. But you didn't. You walked away. And in that silence, the power dynamic flipped completely. Suddenly, you weren't the one waiting for validation. They were forth, the mirror they shattered. Here's what they failed to grasp. You weren't just another good person in their life. You were their mirror, the reflection of the version of themselves they could have grown into if they had chosen growth over ego. By betraying you, by disrespecting you, they didn't just lose trust. They shattered that mirror. Now, every new relationship they stumble into will feel like a downgrade. Not because those new people are less, but because you carried something rare: depth, loyalty, emotional clarity, and boundaries that demanded respect. Once someone has experienced that, anything less feels hollow. They'll spend years chasing that same reflection, but all they'll find are shadows of what you gave so freely. Fifth, your calm was never indifference. This is where people get it wrong. You weren't calm because you didn't care. You were calm because you refused to abandon your values just to keep someone who kept dishonoring them. That isn't cold detachment, it's mastery. It's the discipline of choosing self-respect over cheap validation. And while they thought they were controlling you, in reality you were reclaiming your power in silence. You saw through the games. You saw through the masks. And when you finally walked away, you didn't just exit, you liberated yourself. So yes, they underestimated you. They thought a few breadcrumbs of attention, a smile here, a sweet word there, would keep you tied to them forever. But what they didn't understand is that you weren't starving. You were fasting. And fasting builds strength, discipline, and clarity, the very things they never developed. Now they're realizing far too late that they didn't just lose a nice person. Nice people are everywhere. They lost someone rare, someone who carried a depth, a loyalty, and an authenticity that's almost impossible to find in this world. And what follows after such a loss isn't revenge. It's revelation. Here's the truth most people never grasp about betrayal. It's not only a wound against the person you hurt. It's a fracture inside the betrayer themselves. When someone crosses a line they knew was sacred, when they violate the trust of a person who genuinely had their back, they imagine they're walking away victorious. They think they won, but they're not walking away stronger. They're walking away damaged. They're walking away fractured. And the most tragic part? They don't even realize it yet, because betrayal is always self-sabotage in disguise. First, every act of cruelty chips away at character. You cannot harm someone good and remain good. You cannot manipulate someone who gave you emotional safety without eroding the part of you that once believed in love, loyalty, and honesty. People tell themselves stories to justify it. She was too much. I had to protect myself. They'll get over it. But deep down, beneath the excuses, the soul remembers. You may forget the details, but you never forget what you became in that moment. And while betrayal may look like a single decision, its psychological erosion continues long after the act is done. Second, the internal decay begins quietly. Most assume punishment comes from the outside, a ruined reputation, a breakup, a friend group that won't trust them anymore. But the real punishment starts in silence, inside. It begins as a restlessness you can't explain, as anxiety without a name. It creeps in as distrust toward every new connection, as sleepless nights no distraction can numb. Because once you've hurt someone pure in their intention, you've poisoned the soil of your own identity. And everything you tried to plant afterward new. Relationships, new opportunities, new love grows weaker in that poisoned ground. Third, betraying the loyal is a spiritual crime. Not all betrayals are equal. To betray someone transactional who never invested much is common. It happens every day. But betraying someone who was loyal, who believed in you, who saw potential in you, who poured love and patience into your growth, that's not just immoral, it's spiritually destructive. Because you didn't just reject a person, you rejected the sacred opportunity to evolve. You threw away the one person who saw you, not for who you pretended to be, but for who you could have become. And that choice, that rejection of growth, will follow you like a shadow that never leaves. Fourth, the friend who burned the bridge. Picture this. A man spends years confiding in a close friend. He shares his insecurities, his dreams, his secrets. That friend listens, encourages, offers advice until jealousy creeps in. One day that same friend lies behind his back, makes a move on the woman he loved, poisons mutual relationships to get ahead. And for what? A temporary boost in power? A fleeting sense of control? Years later, that friend looks around and realizes he's surrounded by shallow connections and empty conversations. He has no one left he can truly trust, no one he can open up to. And deep down, he knows exactly why. He burned the one bridge he couldn't afford to lose. He burned the bridge he now desperately needs, but it's gone forever. And the cruel irony? He lit the match himself. That's betrayal. That's self-sabotage in its purest form. 5. Your pain was real, but it was never pointless. Yes, you bled from it. Yes, it carved through your chest like broken glass. But now you see clearly, their betrayal was not the end of you. It was the end of their access to you. It didn't destroy you, it freed you. And in that freedom, something profound happened. Their betrayal became the beginning of their descent into the chaos they thought they had escaped. Because people don't only betray others. When they betray someone good, they betray the very part of themselves that still believed in goodness. That fracture spreads inside them like rot. 6. The psychological boundaries they violated were their own. You held space. You listened. You gave. But you also drew lines, firm, sacred, unspoken boundaries. And when they stepped across those lines, they weren't just crossing you. They were crossing themselves. They proved in their own mind what they were capable of. That is the hidden cost of betrayal. Not only losing someone's trust, but losing the image of yourself you once respected. You can lie to others. You can distract yourself. You can scroll endlessly, drink heavily, laugh loudly. But none of it erases the shame of becoming someone you can no longer admire when you look in the mirror. 7. Your absence amplifies their conscience. Now they sit with the echo of what they did. Not because you remind them, not because you keep showing up in their messages, but precisely because you don't. That's the Stoic way. You didn't fight. You didn't chase. You let silence do the haunting. And silence, when backed by dignity, is the loudest justice there is. Deep down they know they didn't just lose someone good. They lost access to the version of themselves your presence used to call forward. And that loss, that reminder that they destroyed their own best chance to evolve, is the kind of pain you don't recover from Doc. So while they drown themselves in distractions, another drink, another fling, another false smile, you rise with clarity, with peace, with purpose. And that quiet rise devastates them more than any revenge ever could. Because you didn't destroy them, you didn't plot against them. You simply walked away, and that alone was enough to unravel the false empire they built on the lie of control. They never thought you'd actually leave. They expected drama. They expected tears, shouting matches, accusations, something chaotic they could twist into. A story where you were the problem. But you gave them none of that. No closure, no warning, just silence, just absence. And that's what truly broke them. 1. When you withdrew, their illusion shattered. Manipulators thrive in chaos. They depend on noise. If you scream, they label you unstable. If you cry, They paint you as manipulative. If you chase, they call you obsessed. But when you leave with quiet confidence, when you don't react the way they rehearsed in their head, you tear their script apart. You rob them of the story they plan to tell the world. And more than that, you force them to face the one truth they can't escape. The mask slips, and they see who they really are. And that reflection, without your light softening it, is unbearable. They can't twist silence into a weapon. They can't manipulate grace into weakness. They can't play the victim when the person they wronged simply disappeared. That's the one thing they never rehearsed for your absence. 2. Walking away is not weakness, it's mastery. There's a Stoic truth most people miss. True power isn't proven by confrontation, it's revealed by control. And you controlled the one thing they thought they owned: your reaction. You didn't clap back, you didn't beg for understanding. You didn't waste breath explaining your worth to someone determined not to see it. Instead, you enforced your boundaries with the sharpest tool of all, your silence, because your presence was medicine. They didn't realize it until the prescription ran out. Now they scramble, not because of anything you've said, but because of everything you stopped saying. And that silence, it locked them in a room with the very monster they've been trying to escape, their own conscience. 3. Real strength doesn't scream. It walks. They believe they had power over you until you stopped chasing closure, until you stopped giving second, third, fourth chances, until you stopped defending your value to people who were committed to misunderstanding it. That's when the truth dawned. Power was never theirs. They were just loud. You were never weak. You were simply composed. Walking away from toxicity isn't retreat. It's ascension. It's saying, this is no longer aligned with my peace, my growth, my future. That kind of decision takes emotional maturity most people never reach. But you did. And that's why your silence hits harder than any fight could. 4. The collapse they never saw coming. Outwardly, they still perform. The selfies look happy. The laughter seems effortless. The nights out appear full. But it's all camouflage for the unraveling that has already begun. It starts small. Conversations feel hollow. Connections slip away too quickly. Trust becomes a foreign language. Their life turns into a rotating stage of faces they can't connect to, because the one person who saw them clearly, who rooted for their growth in the middle of chaos, is gone. And no imitation can replace what was real. They didn't just lose you. They lost access to peace, to accountability, to growth. And they know it even if they'll never admit it. 5. Example. The ex who thought you'd crawl back. Take the story of a woman who was gaslit for years. She was told her standards were too high, her needs too heavy, her love too demanding. For years she carried the weight of that manipulation. But one day, without fireworks, without shouting, without drama, she left. No dramatic goodbye. No tears on the doorstep. Just quiet distance. And that silence became the loudest sound her ex had ever heard. Months later, long after she walked away, he still finds himself scrolling through her social feed at 2 in the morning. And what does he see? Not the collapse he predicted, not the broken version he secretly hoped for. Instead, she's glowing, focused, radiant, alive with a clarity he cannot stand to look at for too long. Not because she hurt him, but because she didn't crumble without him. That quiet progress, that quiet confidence, it gnaws at him. Because deep down, he knows the most devastating truth. She finally saw him for who he was. And that vision required no argument, no confrontation, just the courage to walk away. 6. They lost their power the moment you reclaimed yours. The shift didn't happen with a fight. It didn't come from a dramatic ending. It came the instant you stopped begging for their approval. The moment you realized your boundaries never needed an explanation, especially not to people committed to crossing them again and again. That's when the collapse began, because real power has nothing to do with volume. It doesn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the one with nothing left to prove. And now, that's you. You've moved on not with anger, not with theatrics, but with grace, with focus, with an inner strength so complete they'll never have access to it again. So let them pretend. Let them pose. Let them laugh louder than they need to. Because when the noise fades, when the parties end, when the room goes quiet, that's when the truth stabs the deepest. They didn't just lose an argument, they lost a future. Regret doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It doesn't come with apology letters or grand gestures. Real regret slips in quietly. It arrives at night when the phone is silent. It creeps in during stillness, when there's nothing left to distract the mind. Because when you lose someone, rare someone who saw you fully, supported you when you doubted yourself, believed in you when you had nothing to offer, that loss doesn't crash down in one blow. It seeps in moment by moment until it becomes inescapable. 1. The room feels louder when you're gone. There's always a moment when the laughter fades, when the distractions no longer entertain, when the crowd grows dull and the room falls still. And in that silence, they remember. They remember your grounding presence, the calm tone of your voice, the way you anchored chaos without ever needing to raise your volume. They remember how your energy didn't demand attention, but commanded respect. And now there is only noise. Empty noise. People who don't understand, connections without depth, familiarity without meaning. That's when the echo begins. 2. The echo of what they destroyed. The weight isn't just in your absence. It's in the realization that they caused it. They broke what was whole. They pushed away the one person who offered them stability, loyalty, clarity. And now they must live with the slow realization that they destroyed something irreplaceable, not because such people don't exist, but because they will never again have access to the version of you that trusted them. This is spiritual justice, not divine punishment, not bad luck, but the unavoidable consequence of being left alone with the truth. And this time there is no one to blame but themselves. 3. Example. The friend who keeps scrolling. He still checks your profile, pretending it doesn't matter. He tells himself you were too much, too emotional, too intense. Yet every time he sees your smile, every time he sees how centered, grounded, and unshakable you've become, something gnaws at him. It's not jealousy, not even longing, it's guilt. The kind of guilt that lingers not in words, but in silence. Deep down, he knows the truth he'll never admit out loud. They only ever wanted good things for me, and I ruined it. That realization doesn't explode in a single moment. It doesn't shout. It whispers relentlessly in the quietest hours. It slips into his thoughts while driving alone. When the night feels longer than it should, when sleep won't come no matter how tired he is. That's the echo of regret. It's not dramatic, but it's constant. 4. Regret is the mind's quietest punishment. The world won't always strip them of their status. They may keep their social circle. They may find another relationship. On the surface, it might look like they moved on unscathed. But inside, the decay begins. They question their own worth in every new connection. They hesitate to trust, not because others are untrustworthy, but because they know they are. They expect betrayal, because once you've crossed the line into becoming the betrayer, you see yourself reflected everywhere you go. They grow guarded. They grow disconnected. They grow hollow, not because life is cruel, but because they no longer respect who they've become. And that is the punishment no one else can see, but the one they can never escape. 5. Your absence doesn't just hurt, it reflects. Here's the cruel beauty of distance. It doesn't simply remind them of you. It reminds them of who they could have become if they had chosen differently. If they had embraced your emotional intelligence instead of mocking it. If they had honored your psychological boundaries instead of trampling them. If they had chosen growth over ego. You weren't just another good person passing through their life. You were a mirror showing them a version of themselves that was possible, a version that could have risen higher. Now that mirror is gone, and all that's left for them is the shadow of who they refused to become. 6. The irony of silence. They wanted control. They wanted to dominate the story. They wanted you to break down, to spiral, to scream, so they could point and say, "See, I was right to leave." But you didn't. You didn't beg. You didn't crumble. You didn't even argue. You vanished into your purpose, into your peace, into a life bigger than the one they ever imagined for you. And now the silence you left behind isn't indifference, it's consequence. Because silence doesn't let them rewrite the narrative. Silence doesn't give them fresh material to twist. Silence forces them to face the truth, and worst, to face the fact that they were the cause of it all. 7. Let the echo do the work. You don't need to chase them. You don't need to send closure texts. You don't need to remind them of what they lost. Life is already doing that for you. The silence they hear in every quiet room, the reflection that stings when they see what you've become, that's louder than any words you could ever say. So let the silence haunt them. Let your peace confront their chaos. Let your absence become the voice that echoes in their mind day after day. Because the truth about regret is this: it's not loud, but it never leaves. While they chase noise, validation, and distraction, you move in silence toward clarity, toward strength, toward real peace. Because what they once dismissed as boring was actually the only place in their life where they were safe, understood, and anchored. And now that it's gone, they will feel the echo of that mistake for the rest of their days. People talk endlessly about closure. It's the thing they say they need in order to move on. But here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to admit. You don't need closure from someone who is fully committed to misunderstanding you. You don't need an apology from someone who knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. What you need isn't closure, it's peace. And peace doesn't beg. Peace doesn't negotiate. Peace doesn't wait for permission to heal. 1. You don't need the last word. You need inner stillness. For the longest time, maybe you believed If they could just admit what they did, if they would just acknowledge the damage, then I could finally breathe. But that's the illusion. What you were truly craving wasn't closure. It was justice. It was accountability. You wanted them to finally step into the role they pretended to play, to show you the integrity they wore like a mask. But maturity means recognizing this moment will never come, not because you were unworthy of it, but because they were never capable of giving it. Expecting honesty from someone committed to lies is like expecting water in a desert. It's a trap that keeps you thirsty forever. 2. The Stoic truth. Closure is an internal process. The Stoics taught that peace can never hinge on someone else's behavior. Waiting for their apology before releasing anger is not strength, it's bondage. Waiting for their recognition before affirming your worth is not healing, it's dependence. And waiting for them to admit guilt before letting go of poison, that's like handing them your freedom all over again. True closure is not about their words. It's about your decision to no longer let their choices dictate your peace. Dependency, disguised as closure, is still dependency. 3. Forgiveness without contact is a superpower. There is a profound kind of strength in being able to whisper to yourself, "I forgive you," not because they asked, not because they changed, not because they deserve it, but because you refuse to carry their mistake any longer. Forgiveness is not a gift you hand to them, it's a chain you unlock for yourself. You forgive not to reconnect, not to reopen doors that were wisely closed, but to free yourself from the weight of their betrayal. You forgive silently, stoically, spiritually, because your worth no longer depends on the validation of someone who tried to destroy it. That is self-discipline in action. That is what it means to guard your soul. 4. Closure isn't a conversation. It's a decision. They may never say, "I'm sorry." They may never whisper, "I was wrong." They may never even think they were wrong, but you don't need their cooperation to reclaim your peace. Because closure was never about them, it was about you. Closure is the moment you accept reality in full. Acceptance of who they are, without illusions. Acceptance of what they did, without excuses. Acceptance that the future you hoped for with them has expired, and no resurrection is coming. The very moment you stop waiting for them to make things right is the moment you take your life back into your own hands. 5. Example. The letter never sent. She wrote it carefully, every sentence sharpened with truth, every wound named, every betrayal illuminated. She wanted him to read it, to feel it, to finally understand the gravity of what he had done. She wanted justice in ink. But then she folded the paper, put it away, and never sent it. Why? Because she realized the purpose of writing wasn't to deliver it to him, it was to release it from her. She didn't need him to validate her pain. She needed herself to honor it, to acknowledge it, and then to let it go. That is closure. That is power. Why? Because in the act of writing, she stumbled upon a truth more powerful than any reply could ever offer. The healing was never going to come from his response. It came from her ability to give language to her pain, to articulate her truth, and then to release it into the silence. That's what closure really is. It's not about them signing off on the story they ruined. It's about you finishing the chapter without needing the villain's signature on the last page. 6. You were the one who changed. This is the hidden reason why betrayal feels so painfully unfinished. People rarely talk about this part. Why does it feel open-ended, like a song cut off mid-verse? Because you grew, you evolved. You matured while they remained stagnant. You wanted understanding. You were willing to go deeper, to confront the hard conversations, to repair, to rebuild, to restore. They weren't. They wanted shortcuts, control, and the cheap power that comes from avoiding accountability. And when you finally outgrew the dynamic, you began to see truths they couldn't even glance at without crumbling dot. So yes, it feels unfinished, but that's not your burden to carry. That's simply the scar left when someone capable of loving deeply crosses paths with someone only capable of consuming love. It's the mark of someone who could love better than the other was ever able to receive. 7. The peace of letting. The chapter closes itself. Not every story ends with fireworks or confrontation. Some endings are quiet, understated, and yet profoundly final. Sometimes the most powerful act of self-respect is to close the book, walk away, and allow silence to serve as the last line. No bang, no scene, no dramatic curtain call, just distance. Because here's the secret. People reveal everything by what they don't say. Their silence is their testimony. And you reveal your emotional intelligence by not demanding that they say anything at all. That's not coldness, it's clarity. That's not detachment, it's dignity. And in that choice, you demonstrate that what you needed wasn't their words or their apologies. What you truly needed was the strength to choose yourself, and you did. That is the real closure. But here's the tragedy, the part they'll never admit even to themselves. They didn't just lose you. They lost the one mirror that could have shown them the person they had the potential to become. They shattered something sacred. The harsh truth of the next chapter. You weren't just another kind person who wandered through their life. You were something far rarer, a mirror. And not the kind that flatters or filters. Not the kind that reflects the curated version they parade to the world. You reflected something infinitely more terrifying and infinitely more valuable. Who they could have become if they had chosen growth over ego. 1. The purpose of a real mirror. Real mirrors don't lie. They don't blur the edges to make you feel comfortable. They don't distort the image to protect your pride. And that's exactly what your presence represented in their life. You were a reflection of truth, of clarity. You weren't trying to inflate their ego or shield them from consequence. You reflected back their contradictions, not with cruelty but with honesty. You called out the inconsistencies not by shouting, but by living in alignment yourself. You held them accountable, not by punishing them, but by refusing to lower your standards. That is what unsettled them. Because people who are committed to staying broken don't want reflection, they want illusion. And you, with your emotional intelligence, your moral clarity, and your unshakable self-discipline, became a threat to that illusion. 2. You reflected their untapped self. You weren't just showing them who they were in their worst moments, you were reminding them of who they could be if they chose discipline over chaos, love over ego, growth over pride. And that reflection was unbearable because it exposed the gap between the life they were living and the life they were capable of creating. You showed them the better version of themselves they were too afraid to pursue. You didn't just see them, you saw through them. You looked past the carefully constructed mask they wore for the world. You recognized the pain buried beneath their arrogance, the insecurity hiding behind their control, and the humanity that still flickered under all the harm they caused. And you didn't flinch, you didn't run, you stayed, you encouraged. You gave them space to stumble and still rise. You offered patience, guidance, and the rare gift of unconditional belief. You didn't just see who they were, you saw who they could be, healed, honest, whole. But here's the brutal truth. Not everyone wants to be seen that deeply. Because to be seen fully is to be exposed. To be exposed is to be held accountable. And for those still hiding from their truth, accountability doesn't feel like love. It feels like an attack. That's why they recoiled. That's why they ran. 3. They chose to break what they couldn't face. Eventually, the mirror you held up became unbearable. Too sharp, too clear, too honest. And instead of leaning into growth, they reacted. With fear, they pushed you away. They tried to minimize your worth. They labeled you too much, too intense, too emotional, too high maintenance. But those weren't insults. They were confessions. Confessions of fragility. Confessions of a soul too weak to stand in the presence of its own reflection. So they did what cowards always do when truth confronts them. They shattered the mirror. They broke the very thing revealing their brokenness. 4. The tragic irony. Now they're surrounded by comfort, but it's the cheap kind. People who flatter, people who enable, people who never look too closely or ask too deeply. And yet, despite all the noise and validation, something feels missing. The conversations skim the surface. The connections don't satisfy. The energy feels hollow, like eating empty calories. Because once you've been seen by someone who speaks to your soul, it is almost impossible to go back to those who only speak to your image. And that's the pain they'll never admit. They once had that depth with you, and they destroyed it. Not because it lacked value, but because they weren't ready for what it demanded of them. Honesty, discipline, vulnerability. 5. You were rare, and they know it. In a world where people ghost at the first sign of conflict, you stayed. In a culture obsessed with shallow validation, you brought uncomfortable truth. In a society addicted to attention, you gave presence. While most people were trained only to take, you gave again and again. That's rare. That's irreplaceable. They'll never confess it out loud. Not to anyone. Maybe not even to themselves. But deep down they know. They know they didn't just lose a relationship. They lost the only person willing to walk beside their transformation. 6. Your presence was a sacred gift. You weren't just a partner, or a friend, or a lover. You were a spiritual invitation. You were the mirror that said, I see who you are, and I see who you're meant to become. Let's rise together. But instead of rising, they resisted. Instead of leaning in, they lashed out. Instead of thanking you, they punished you. That wasn't your failure. That was their fear in motion. And now that opportunity is gone, not because you slammed the door, but because they shattered the very window to their own evolution. And here's the haunting truth. They will search. They will try to recreate what they lost. They will chase shadows of your depth in other people. But what you gave them was sacred, rare, unrepeatable. But here's the tragedy. They will search endlessly, but what they'll discover is that most people reflect nothing. Most people mirror only the shallow surface, feeding egos instead of souls. You, however, reflected everything. You showed them not only who they were, but who they could have been. That is why your absence echoes louder than any presence they'll ever find again. And in the next chapter, we need to confront the deeper cost. Because when someone betrays not just a person, but a spiritual mirror, the damage isn't external, it's internal, corrosive and permanent. Some betrayals don't simply end relationships. They fracture the soul. Not all betrayals are the same. When toxic people betray each other, it's chaos meeting chaos, two storms colliding, both destructive, both predictable. But when you betray someone good, someone grounded, loyal, emotionally sincere, you don't just hurt them. You cut into the very core of your own integrity. And that fracture doesn't heal with time. It grows in silence, spreading like rust, corroding everything you touch. 1. Hurting someone good is a violation of the soul. There is a rare purity in people who still believe in genuine connection. They are patient when others are impatient. They forgive when others punish. They choose love even when they are not fully loved in return. To betray a person like that isn't just an act of cruelty. It's spiritual sabotage. You violate a sacred space, a sanctuary of trust, vulnerability, and grace. And the universe may not punish you in lightning bolts and thunder, but your conscience will. Because no matter how loud the ego defends itself, the soul always remembers when a moral line has been crossed. 2. The soul doesn't forget what the ego tries to justify. People lie to themselves. You were too sensitive. You expected too much. It wasn't that serious. But excuses don't erase guilt. They only postpone the reckoning. When you betray someone who wanted nothing but to love you honestly, support your growth, and build something real with you, the guilt you carry isn't just emotional, it's existential. It changes the way you see yourself. One day you realize the truth. I became the villain in a story where someone was trying to save me. 3. Example. The man who abandoned the woman who believed in him. She stood beside him in the darkest seasons. She supported him through depression, lifted him when he doubted himself, defended his name when no one else did. She believed in his dreams before he believed in them. And yet, when success finally arrived, he convinced himself he had outgrown her. He left coldly, abruptly, without explanation. Years later, he smiles for photos next to someone new. He posts achievements, vacations, filtered snapshots of a perfect life. But in the quiet moments when the noise fades, when the applause stops, he remembers. He remembers the one who saw him when he had nothing, the one who stayed when it was hardest. And that memory does not fade, it grows heavier with each superficial success. Because he didn't just lose a woman, he lost a part of himself that still believed in unconditional love. 4. The psychological erosion begins. Betraying a good soul doesn't end with the moment of betrayal. It begins there. The erosion of character starts to seep into every new relationship. Trust feels impossible, not because the world is untrustworthy, but because they shattered trust within themselves. Every smile feels false. Every connection feels fragile. The soil of their identity is poisoned, and nothing authentic can grow there anymore. Joy feels fleeting for them, because guilt never rests. Even in moments that should feel light, something gnaws at them. Connections feel hollow, because they no longer have a mirror that reflects growth only shallow reactions that feed nothing. Real, slowly, almost without noticing, they sabotage themselves. They draw chaos into their orbit. They distrust love because they can no longer trust themselves. They push people away, convinced that everyone else is fake, because deep down, they know they are. That is the hidden cost of betrayal. Self-destruction disguised as freedom. 5. You were the chance they weren't ready for. When you entered their life, you were not just another friend, partner, or passing connection. You were a spiritual opportunity, an invitation to rise higher, to confront old wounds, to evolve into someone deeper, stronger, more grounded. But evolution requires humility, and humility is terrifying to those addicted to control. So they sabotage the very connection that could have saved them, because rising felt harder than running. Now they are trapped in cycles you've already outgrown. Where you leveled up, they looped back. 6. You walked away clean. They carried the residue. Your soul is no longer entangled in their chaos. You didn't leave with bitterness or vengeance. You left with discipline, with self-respect, with spiritual clarity. You chose healing because you valued your worth. But they didn't just lose you. They absorbed the consequence of betraying you, and those consequences are not dramatic. They are quiet, subtle, inescapable. They appear in restless nights, in the craving for distraction, in the way every new connection feels like a pale imitation of the one they destroyed. 7. The universe doesn't punish, but it balances. Life is not always fair in the way we wish, but it is always just in a deeper sense. You cannot betray someone good and remain untouched. The damage might not show on the outside, and it might not strike immediately, but eventually it reveals itself in the erosion of inner peace, in the slow collapse of integrity, in the emptiness that grows louder every time truth is denied. That's the spiritual cost, not external punishment, but internal disintegration. So while they laugh louder, run faster, post more to convince the world they've moved on inside, a storm is building. And meanwhile, you aren't chasing. You aren't explaining. You aren't waiting. You are evolving. And that brings us to the next truth. What happens when their chaos collides with your clarity? They thought you'd crumble. They assumed your silence meant pain. They believed that without them, you'd break. But the reality is far more unsettling. While they spiral, you ascend. While they repeat old cycles, you reinvent yourself. 1. They repeat, you reinvent. They keep recycling the same shallow games, still performing for strangers, still building fragile relationships on image instead of substance. They're caught in the loop of appearances. You, on the other hand, no longer care to perform. You've turned inward not to escape, but to reconstruct. You've begun prioritizing truth over comfort, depth over distraction, substance over spectacle. And that's the kind of transformation they'll never be able to imitate, because it requires a strength they ran from. 1. While they chase noise, you cultivate clarity. They are still addicted to constant stimulation, scrolling endlessly, seeking validation, desperate for the next distraction to silence the emptiness inside. But you've chosen a different path. You no longer chase chaos, you cultivate clarity. You're building a grounded peace, the kind that no applause, no relationship, no worldly possession can ever provide. It's the kind of calm that Comes from within the peace that endures when everything external fades. 2. What felt like exile became transformation. When they discarded you, it stung like exile. You sat in the silence they left behind, questioning your worth, asking yourself if it was somehow your fault. That silence felt brutal at first, but here is where the shift happened. You stayed long enough in that silence to let it speak, and instead of collapsing, you grew roots. What they mistook for your burial became your rebirth. The soil of isolation nourished a new version of you, stronger, deeper, wiser. That paradox will always haunt them. The darkness they hoped would crush. You became the very place where you bloomed. 3. While they numb, you feel and heal. They're still running from themselves, numbing with noise, distracting with shallow pursuits, surrounding themselves with surface-level company. But you chose the harder, braver road. You felt it, every ounce of heartbreak, every wave of confusion, every truth that burned. And because you felt it, you healed. That's what emotional intelligence truly is, not pretending pain doesn't exist, but facing it boldly and saying, "You don't define me, but you will teach me." And oh, how much it has taught you. 4. Example. The quiet rise. There was a time when you posted just to prove you were fine, to show them you had moved on, hoping to trigger some reaction. But that phase is gone. Now you build a life so aligned, so authentic, you don't care who's watching. You no longer seek to be seen, you seek to be centered. And while they scroll in silence, watching, comparing, unsettled, you keep moving forward untouched. That's the difference. They are still reacting. You are recalibrating. 5. True performance isn't loud. It's structured. Your rise doesn't need noise. It's reflected in discipline. You're sleeping better, eating cleaner, thinking clearer. Your energy is sharper. Your goals are higher. You've built a high-performance mindset not powered by vengeance, but by vision. That's why this version of you is almost unrecognizable from your past self. You no longer beg. You no longer prove. You no longer explain. You don't chase you. Construct. Every day you are becoming someone your past self would look at with awe. 6. They spiral because they refused to grow. Their decline is not because you cursed them. Their decline is the inevitable price of avoiding growth. When confronted with the mirror you held up, they chose distraction. When invited to rise, they chose to run. When offered your loyalty, your wisdom, your soul, they tried to twist it into control. That's not evolution, that's erosion. And now, while your days are marked by structure and clarity, theirs are ruled by impulse and denial. They don't need external punishment. You're already living inside the punishment. A cycle of avoidance, emptiness, and decay. 1. Evolution isn't revenge, it's redemption. You didn't evolve to prove a point. You didn't rise just to show them what they lost. You rose because remaining broken was no longer an option. Growth was survival, not spectacle. You didn't level up for applause, you did it because the version of you that stayed stuck in that chaos was never meant to last. You outgrew the drama, the cycles, the illusions, and yes, you outgrew the need for closure from someone who was never capable of offering it in the first place. That isn't arrogance. That's self-respect. So let them spiral. Let them chase stimulation surround themselves with shallow replacements, and wonder why nothing satisfies. That is their journey now, because your evolution doesn't revolve around them anymore, but your absence, that still echoes. 2. Silence, the quiet power they never expected. They expected noise. They wanted chaos. They prepared for confrontation, for arguments they could twist, for tears they could frame as weakness. They even rehearsed the narrative where you played the villain. But what they never prepared for, the one weapon they could not control, was your silence. And silence, when wielded with discipline, is not emptiness. It is the most devastating form of justice. 3. Silence is not weakness, it's mastery. To the shallow and insecure, silence feels like surrender. But those who fear reflection always mistake stillness for weakness. The truth? Silence is not the absence of power, it is power under control. It is the refusal to feed chaos with energy. It is the emotional maturity to let the truth echo without interruption. Retaliation is loud, temporary, and fleeting. Silence is eternal. You didn't react, you didn't explain, you didn't chase. You became the void they never thought they'd lose, and now that space is unreachable. 4. Your absence stole the spotlight. They thrived on your reactions. They craved your attention, your presence, your emotions. You were their audience, their validation, their stage, until you weren't. The day you withdrew, the curtain dropped, and the performance ended. Now they perform to emptiness. And nothing humiliates a manipulator more than realizing the one person who made them feel significant no longer cares to watch the show. Your absence didn't make them stronger. It exposed just how fragile they really were. 5. Example. The narcissist who lost his stage. He used to provoke her just to spark a reaction. Anger became his applause, arguments his oxygen. Every outburst was fuel, every tear his proof of control. But one day she simply stopped responding. No calls, no texts, no tears, no fights, just stillness. And in that stillness his illusion of power collapsed. Because narcissists don't thrive on control itself, they thrive on your response to their control. And when you remove the response, you remove the very stage on which they performed. That was the day his power died. 6. The psychological weight of being erased. Most people can handle confrontation. They can rationalize it, argue against it, even twist it into justification. What they cannot handle is silence. What they cannot bear is erasure, the quiet, piercing reality of being forgotten by someone who once gave them everything. Confrontation lets them believe they still matter. But absence? Absence reveals they never did. 1. Being replaced not with someone else, but with peace. That's the twist they never expected. You didn't run into another's arms. You didn't need a rebound, a substitute, or a distraction. You chose peace. And that's what humiliates them most, because deep down, they know you're not angry. You are simply done, and there is no script for that. No defense against it. No recovery from being silently dismissed by someone who once had all of you. 2. Silence removed their excuse. When you don't fight back, when you don't plead, when you don't play games, you strip them of every defense. They can't call you unstable because you're calm. They can't call you obsessed because you vanished. They can't accuse you of manipulation because you stepped off the board entirely. And now the only story left is the truth. They caused the silence they now fear. You didn't slam the door. You simply stopped opening it. That's not passivity, that's quiet authority. 3. Absence isn't passive, it's transformational. Your absence has weight. It reshapes the air in their room. It lingers in their timeline. It follows them into every shallow conversation. Because you weren't just another presence, they lost their anchor, their mirror, their sanctuary, and now they feel the hollow echo of what they destroyed. That's not passivity. That's power with a spine. Spiritual power. 4. The Stoic art of leaving without noise. You didn't curse them. You didn't expose them. You didn't even confront them. You left, quietly, with dignity, with discipline. And that silence became their sentence. A reminder that you weren't dismissed out of hatred, but out of recognition. You finally remembered your worth. And once someone rediscovers their worth, they never return to begging for validation. That is mastery in action. So let them talk. Let them fill the air with excuses, with gossip, with noise. None of it will ever be louder than your silence. 5. The victory they'll never understand. Here's the truth most people miss. You didn't win because they lost. You won because you outgrew the version of yourself who tolerated them. The real war was never between you and them. It was within you. The war between your higher self and the version of you that accepted crumbs, tolerated chaos, explained your worth, and ignored your own boundaries. And the moment you chose yourself, you didn't just win, you transcended. You didn't need revenge, you needed release. That's the ultimate Stoic paradox. Your greatest victory wasn't in their downfall, but in your becoming. 1. Release from the illusions. This was never a war against another person. It was a reckoning inside you. A battle between the part of you that once craved to be chosen, that equated love with pain, that silenced your own needs just to keep the peace versus the part of you that finally chose self-respect. You weren't fighting them. You were fighting the voices inside that told you your needs were too much, your voice too loud, your heart too soft. And when you chose to release all of that, you set yourself free. 2. You didn't just walk away from them. You walked away from the old you. The old version of you explained your worth until your throat was dry. Accepted half-love because it was easier than being alone. Quieted your instincts just to avoid conflict. But through heartbreak and fire, that version of you died. And in its place rose someone new, someone who doesn't need to be understood. By those committed to misunderstanding. That's when you won. Not against them, but against the belief that you needed them in order to feel whole. 3. Victory isn't loud, it's quiet. Self-mastery doesn't need applause. It doesn't post for validation or beg for recognition. Victory is rebuilding your spiritual discipline when no one's watching, reinforcing your psychological boundaries with quiet strength, restoring your emotional clarity so you can finally stop negotiating with chaos. It's in becoming the person who doesn't over-explain to confusion anymore, who doesn't fight to prove their value to those blind to it. True victory isn't about proving they'll never see it. It's about being, and you finally know who you are. 4. The old you chased. The new you creates. The old you would have replayed conversations 100 times, stalked their stories, drafted unsent messages, and begged for closure, the new you builds new habits, new peace, new boundaries that don't need explanation, only enforcement. This new self is rooted, grounded, unshakable. And here's the irony. The chaos that once consumed you now looks small, almost laughable, because healing turned you into someone too evolved to ever go back. 5. The Phoenix Moment. You didn't rise out of revenge. You rose because staying in the ashes was no longer an option. This is your Phoenix moment. Undeniable, unstoppable, transformative. You became the person your old self prayed for. The one who no longer tolerates manipulation, who no longer hands out endless grace to those who mock it, who no longer dims intuition to avoid conflict. You rose not to haunt them, but every time your name echoes in silence, it reminds them of what they destroyed, the one person willing to walk them home to themselves. 6. Letting go without needing them to understand. This is the highest level of emotional intelligence. True peace doesn't require permission. True strength doesn't require agreement. You don't need them to get it. You don't need them to validate the reasons you left. You don't explain. You don't justify. You simply let go, because the only explanation you'll ever need is this. Your self-worth is no longer up for debate. 7. The true ending. The end of the story was never about them. Their regret is not your victory. Your rebirth is. The real ending is not the moment they finally realize who you were. It's the moment you finally realize who you've become. Someone who understands peace is more valuable than performance. Someone who values self-respect over approval. Someone who rises quietly and never looks back. You didn't win because they're suffering. You won because you no longer need their validation to define your worth. The old you, the one who kept bleeding for people who wouldn't even hand you a bandage, that version no longer exists. In their place stands someone unshakable, unbothered, unreachable. So no, you didn't win over them. You won over the part of yourself that once believed they were your only chance at love, peace, or meaning. Now you know better. And because you know better, you choose better, live better, and become better. That is the final word. The one they will never rewrite. You didn't scream. You didn't argue. You didn't beg to be seen. You evolved. And in that evolution, you became the closure. The ending they can't escape. The reminder they will never outrun, not because you punished them, but because you walked away with a power they never understood. So if you're listening to this and still wondering if you did the right thing by leaving, the answer is yes. Because anyone who makes you doubt your value was never meant to hold it. You didn't lose them. They lost the only version of you, willing to bleed for their redemption. And that version is gone forever. What remains is unshakable, untouchable, unbothered. You are not waiting for consequences. You are the consequence. If this message touched something deep inside you, if it reminded you of your quiet strength and your untouchable worth, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video to anchor the truth. Share it with someone who's still healing in silence. And subscribe to Stoic Craft, where we don't play the victim, we master the storm. Because here your silence isn't weakness. It's your greatest superpower.